The hearing in this matter, dealing with Judge Mukasey, has been good. Judiciary Committee with Senators Leahy and Specter did a good job. A full airing of this man's qualifications and ideas were put before the American people in the United States Senate. The debate that has transpired today, dealing with Michael Mukasey, has been extremely good. It's been good for the process. It's good for the American people to understand that the chief law enforcement officer of this country has had a fair hearing and a good debate here in the United States Senate. I will vote against the nomination of Michael Mukasey for Attorney General. My historical analysis is different than that of my good friend, the senior senator from Kentucky. Much different. Mr. President, it's
We would ask the members of the gallery to cease their conversations.
Thank you, Mr. President. Appreciate that. Mr. President, it's regrettable that I must vote no. When the President first nominated Michael Mukasey, I was fully prepared to support him. That's the history I remember. Judge Mukasey has a stellar reputation for integrity and judicial excellence throughout his decades of government service. He has an excellent academic background. I was pleased to see that after the Gonzales debacle and with the Justice Department in shambles, the President finally relented to pressure from Senate Democrats to look beyond his inner circle for this most important appointment. And I consider it significant that an administration that has shown such contempt for the other two branches of government, particularly judges, would turn to a candidate who served in the judicial branch for so many years. So, like many Democrats, I was predisposed to support this nomination. In fact, I was prepared to embrace this nomination. I, too, met with Judge Mukasey and told him that I was impressed with his credentials and his background, and I hope the hearing went well. Well, Mr. President, the hearing didn't go well, from my perspective. During this confirmation process, Judge Mukasey expressed views about executive power that I and many other senators found deeply disturbing. And I was outraged by his evasive, hair-splitting approach to questions about the legality of waterboarding. After his initial comments, Judge Mukasey was given every opportunity to address these concerns, but he was unable to state clearly that waterboarding is torture and therefore illegal under United States law. This is not a difficult or complex legal question. It does not require high-level security briefings. I agree with former Navy General Counsel Alberto Mora and former Assistant Secretary of State John Shattuck, who wrote in an op-ed this week, and I quote, "The question of whether waterboarding constitutes torture is a no-brainer," end of quote. Why is it a no-brainer? My friend, former Nevadan and now a longtime federal judge, Evan Wallach, a former decorated Vietnam combat veteran who came back into military service in the first Gulf War and is now a leading expert on the law of war. Judge Wallach wrote in a recent Washington Post article, in fact it was last Sunday on the front page of this opinion section, and I quote, "The media usually characterize the practice as simulated drowning. That's incorrect. To be effective, waterboarding is usually real drowning that simulates death," end of quote. The only difference between actual drowning and waterboarding is that the waterboarding process is halted before death. Victims inhale water, suffocate, and often pass out. Who could reasonably argue that this is anything other than torture? Judge Wallach further points out in a related law review article in the Columbia Law Review that even under the extreme and now disavowed legal theories of former Justice Department officials like John Yoo, waterboarding still constitutes torture. Can there be any question, Judge Wallach says, that water torture, the repetitive artificial drowning and revival of another human being, falls within the memo's parameters? No, there can be no question at all. Notwithstanding the novel legal theories of the Bush administration, whose approval rating as we speak, Mr. President, is 23%. And we wonder why. It's long been settled law in this nation around the world that waterboarding is torture and it is illegal. Civil and military courts in the United States have rejected waterboarding, as Senator Leahy has said more than once here today, for more than 100 years, whether directed at or committed by Americans. U.S. soldiers were court-martialed for using water torture to question Philippine guerrillas during the United States occupation of the Philippines after the 1898 Spanish-American War. After World War II, the United States prosecuted and convicted Japanese soldiers for waterboarding American and Allied prisoners of war. And during the 1980s, a Texas sheriff was sentenced to 10 years in prison for using waterboarding to force confessions of prisoners. So this is not a new debate, nor an unsettled question. Judge Mukasey doesn't need a classified briefing from the Bush White House to answer the question, is waterboarding torture? He has more than 100 years of established American law on which to base his position. His position was evasive, without any question, misleading. That's why it's so disturbing that for all his impressive years on the bench, Judge Mukasey could not give a simple, straightforward answer to the question posed by members of the Judiciary Committee. Democrats and Republicans. His lengthy, non-responsive answer was wrong. This was a question that demanded brevity and certainty, not lawyerly semantics. My Republican colleagues, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, and John Warner, who served as leaders in the United States Senate on this issue, recently issued a detailed legal analysis that concluded that waterboarding, quote, represents a clear violation of the United States law, end of quote. And I think, Mr. President, for purposes of this debate, let's give a little added credence to a man who served 7 years in a Vietnamese prison camp and was tortured more than half the time that he was there. The rest of the time was in solitary confinement. John McCain. Let's give that a little more foundation. But, Mr. President, former and sitting judge advocate generals agree. On Friday, in a letter to the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, several prominent former judge advocate generals declared unequivocally, and I quote, waterboarding is inhumane, it is torture, it is illegal. Waterboarding detainees amounts to illegal torture in all circumstances, end of quote. I could continue at length quoting military and civilian experts who all agree that the answer to this question is settled. And it is settled. But why is this issue of waterboarding so critical for the chief law enforcement officer of our country, the United States Attorney General? Tremendous damage has been done to the moral credibility of our great country, both in the eyes of our allies and of our enemies abroad, by the widespread belief that our country, the United States, has used waterboarding and other abusive interrogation techniques. The United States of America has done that. All over the world now they know it. As a result, our allies have at times refused to cooperate with us in the fight against terrorism under constraints from their own laws and public opinion at home. Even if the Bush administration is no longer utilizing waterboarding, which is, I don't know now, the President's refusal to publicly disavow it gives license to our enemies abroad to use it. This puts our troops and any citizen who may fall into our enemies' hands at risk and serves as an ongoing recruiting tool for militant extremists. How do these evil people who are trying to do damage to this country, how are they using the fact that America tortures people that they want to get information from? How is this as a recruiting tool for these bad people? A pretty good one, I would think. President Bush claims that we must not disclose our techniques to the enemy. But I contend that we should shout from the hills and rooftops for all to hear that no matter how hateful the actions of our enemies, we will never relinquish our most treasured commitment to human rights. That's America, Mr. President. Not water torture, not thumbscrews, not the rack. We should make it clear to all the world that no matter what our enemies do, our core American values cannot be shaken. We are a constitutional form of government. We deserve an Attorney General who will uphold this message to the world. Judge Mukasey's answer to the waterboarding question was important in itself, but it also raised for me serious doubts about whether he is prepared to be the truly independent voice that the Justice Department, which is now in shambles, so desperately needs. If he cannot stand up to the President on such a question of profound importance and simplicity with a clear legal answer, how can we be sure that he would be more than just another mouthpiece for an administration that treasures secrecy and loyalty above all? I respect Judge Mukasey's long career in public service. I've said that before. We've met in person. I've said that before. And there's no question that he's an intelligent man, and in the past has been very capable. If he's confirmed, the eyes of every American will be on him as he faces the inevitable task of depoliticizing the Department of Justice and restoring the integrity that was so lacking under his predecessor, Alberto Gonzales. He will have my earnest support in that challenge. But in light of his responses during and following his confirmation hearings, I cannot stand by him today with my words or my vote. One day, Mr. President, historians will expend countless reams of paper and barrels of ink writing the story of the Bush administration, the Bush-Cheney administration, their extremism in support of its never-ending quest to expand the reach of their executive power. There's no question that this time will be remembered as a dark chapter in America's otherwise steady march toward justice. But for now, all we can do is honor the trust and authority given to us as individual senators by the American people and do what we as senators can to turn the page to a brighter day, because it needs to be turned. What we can do today is reject this nomination. The next Attorney General must be able to stand up to the President and stand up for the rule of law. If confirmed, I hope Judge Mukasey is up to that challenge. But because he has not given me confidence in his independence, I will vote against confirmation, and I urge my colleagues to do the same.